Good day, my name is Franco Ferrari, and today I'm going to show you how to remove a wheel bearing, clean it, repack it, and install it correctly. To perform this task, you'll need some rags, ball peen hammer, air gun, grease cap removing tool, diagonal pliers, bearing packer, extreme pressure grease, slip joint pliers, suitable pair of gloves, and a suitable parts washer. The first step is using your grease cap removal tool. Place it in the groove between the cap and the hub and tap the top of the tool using a ball peen hammer. This will loosen the grease cap and then you can simply remove it. This exposes the cotter pin, castellated nut, and tongue washer. Next step is to remove the cotter pin. I bend the cotter pin down and grab the top of the cotter pin with my diagonal cutters and pry up. Using your slip joint pliers, remove the castellated nut by turning it counterclockwise. Remove the castellated nut using your hand. Grabbing onto the wheel studs, pull the hub forward until the tongue washer and outer bearing come off. Next step is to reinstall the castellated nut. We reinstalled the castellated nut so that we can remove the axle seal and inner wheel bearing. For this part of the process, after placing your two tapered roller bearings in the parts washer, I've put on neoprene safety gloves and a shop coat to protect my clothes from the chemicals in the parts washer. Next step is to clean your roller bearings. Doing so, I place the bearing underneath the parts washer chemical and use the brush to clean the bearing, removing all the old grease. After cleaning your tapered roller bearings and the parts washer, the next step is to air dry them using the air gun and compressed air. After your bearings are good and dry, the next step is to repack them. To do so, I scoop out some extreme pressure wheel bearing grease into my hand and I place it into my palm. Securely holding the wheel bearing, I force the extreme pressure grease through the rollers. What I'm looking for is that the grease is squeezing out between the rollers. Now turn your bearing and continue this process, forcing the grease between the rollers. This is the most important part of the process. Now we're ready to install our bearing. Take some of the leftover grease and coat the outside of the bearing. Then install it into the hub. The next step is to repack the outer wheel bearing, repeating the same process. The next step is to install your axle seal. To do so, place your axle seal into the hub and gently tap around the seal until it's installed. The next step is to install your hub back onto the wheel spindle. As I mentioned earlier in the video, these are two tapered roller bearings. The taper part of the wheel bearing has to go in towards the hub. The next step is the tongue washer. Be sure that the tongue fits into this wheel spindle. After the tongue washer was installed, I then installed my castellated nut. I then use my slip joint pliers and I turn the hub as I tighten my castellated nut. This seats the bearing. The second part of this process of trying to seat the bearing is loosening the castellated nut and spinning the hub. There are many methods of tightening this castellated nut. The method that I prefer is to tighten the castellated nut, then loosen, then use my two bare hands to tighten the nut. What you may find is the hole in the spindle in which the cotter pin is supposed to fit is not lined up correctly. To install the cotter pin, you may need to loosen the castellated nut until the cotter pin will fit through the wheel spindle. The cotter pin now projects down through the spindle. Gripping the cotter pin with your diagonal cutters, bend one part of the cotter pin up. Remove the excess. The second part of the cotter pin can also be removed with the diagonal cutters. The last part is to install the grease cap with your ball peen hammer. And that's how you remove, clean, repack, and install 2 tapered roller bearings.